Hi, I'm Dr. George Yancey. Let's shatter some paradigms. And the paradigm I want to share today concerns whiteness among progressives. You know, a lot of research, a lot of discussion has been on whiteness. And usually when they talk about whiteness, they refer to white conservatives. So you hear about white evangelicals or white conservatives. And there is a lot of research on that, a ton of research on that. And one of my arguments is that we talk so much about white conservatives, we forget about white progressives. There has been a recent book that's addressed that. And one of these days I will do a review of that book because I think it's very interesting. I've done some articles on white progressives because I think that they need attention too. We should take our critical analysis on white progressives just as much as white conservatives. And I would argue that in some ways, white progressives have more per capita power than white conservatives. But one of the things that, when you look at this, is to ask the question, why white? Why do you talk about white conservatives instead of just conservatives? White evangelicals instead of just evangelicals? And that is a very fair question. And the reason why, just looking at white conservatives, is that white conservatives are different from conservatives of color in many ways. And this goes down to whiteness itself being a quality. And so, what a lot of the research has said is looked at a lot of characteristics of whiteness, and I'm not going to go through, a whole list of these characteristics, but whiteness has been attributed to a lot of characteristics, and to be honest, a lot of them are negative. Whiteness is defined as, this desire to have power, to maintain a status quo, to dominate people. That's one of the characteristics of whiteness. And so when they talk about white conservatives, as opposed to, say, conservatives of color or white evangelicals, the evangelicals of color, sometimes what they talk about is how the whites, conservatives, evangelicals, have a need to dominate people of color. Okay. How would that play out among white progressives? Now, that's an interesting question. I'll tell you why. Because we do know that progressives, they pride themselves, or they identify, have an identity as being tolerant and inclusive, especially on issues such as race, sexualities, things of this nature. So if whiteness means domination, do white progressives somehow seek to dominate people of color? Any way you cut it, when you look at the research, you want to look at quantitative research, qualitative research, the answer to that is no. There are people who complain that white progressives do not go far enough. I'm thinking of the work of D'Angelo and some others. I take that into consideration, but just on a very basic level, I think it's hard to argue that white progressives want to dominate people of color in an overt manner. So, what does this mean? What does whiteness mean to people who are progressive? And how can we make sense of that? All right. If we can accept the construct of whiteness, and one of the elements is to dominate, the question you ask is, who do they dominate? Let me suggest that they do want to dominate, but it's not other people of color, it's other whites. Research I've done, when I look at white progressive Christians, what I have found is that white progressive Christians, the group that they have the most animosity towards, is white conservatives or conservative Christians. That there's an animosity towards other Christians that's stronger than their animosity towards, say, atheists or Buddhists or Jews. This tells me that sometimes the group you want to dominate is not an outgroup the way you think about it, not non-Christians, but other Christians. And my argument is that white progressives, the group they want to dominate, the group they fear, the group that they have animosity towards the most, is other whites. Now, who would these other whites be? Well, I would argue these other whites, they tend to be white conservative Christians. Because when you look at what's been called the culture war, the war over moralities between progressives and conservatives, often Christians make up the conservatives in that culture war, and thus white progressives wanting to fight that culture war, their big enemy are conservative Christians. If whiteness means to dominate, we should think that this can't be limited to just whiteness among conservatives. Whiteness among progressives must also mean to dominate. And the rational thing to do is to think about who do they need to dominate. And their anger is often at conservative Christians. Now, I've done research that shows that white progressives do have more animosity towards conservative Christians than they do towards most other groups. And that animosity has led them to taking positions on political issues such as race, sometimes sexualities. It is part of it. It's not the only thing. I'm not even saying it's the most important thing, but it's part of why they have certain perspectives. Other whites are the wrong whites. It makes sense. In a sense, other whites are embarrassing to these white progressives, especially if they're educated. If they're educated and believe that they have a path toward perfectibility. And I talk about perfectibility in one of my key videos on perfectibility and human depravity. And if these whites are in the way, it's embarrassing. These people represent us, they may be thinking. And they're heretics who have to be dealt with. So, whiteness, to the degree means domination among progressives, means white against white. Surveys out there show that white progressives, that they evaluate whites below people of color on what's called thermometer questions. Their animosities towards whites is greater than any animosity towards people of color. That is reminiscent of what I found among progressive Christians, especially white progressive Christians, have more hostility towards other Christians than non-Christians. Does this make sense? Does this give you something to think about? Does this shatter some paradigms? Shatter paradigms about whiteness and progressives? You know, when you talk about white progressives, why do you talk about white progressives and not just progressives? And I think it's because of this animosity towards other whites. And I'm working on some research that documents this right now. I hope that this gives you something to think about, and I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. If you like discussions like this, consider subscribing to this channel. If you like this particular video, please like it. Please comment. If you don't like it, please comment. I'd like to have more conversations. I'd like to get this going, and I would love for other people to come and comment, and because that gets the message out there, and maybe we can bring people in here to have these sort of discussions. Discussions of nuance, discussions of sociology, faith. That's what I like to see. But thanks for coming by. And please come back. We can shatter some more paradigms.